Welcome back. This is Pat Crumley, and we're having a conversation today with Dr. El-Kati on his new publication, The Hiptionary. Before the break, we were talking about how the people that Dr. Mahmoud was working with in terms of the evolution and also the business model for the creation, or at least the publication of the Hiptionary. And so I thought that was very interesting, that one of the things that you said was that you wanted to work with a group of people that you could publish the book without kind of going the traditional route.
That's right.
And at the same time, you also have a community of people that probably in some way, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, informed or contributed to your work.
Sure.
And so I don't want to belabor that, but if you want to add anything before we go on.
No, I think in addition to that, this the book is published by a local publishing house, Papyrus Publishing, Inc. The publisher is Anura CSI, who's born and raised in the Twin Cities. And one of the real reasons why I wanted to do this is to participate in building an institution, which will be around hopefully long after I'm gone and long after he's gone. Yeah. So those, on the practical side, this is my motivation.
And that's pretty powerful and consistent with how you have instructed those of us who are from the McAllister tradition. One of the words I remember you talking about all the time, or concepts, was codification, the need for institutionalization, so that there's always a legacy. And so with regard to the whole goal of Hiptionary and the legacy that is a part of your vision and your work, one of the things you said in your book, I don't know if it was what I call the afterword or the preface. You were talking about that Hiptionary, that the goal of it was to be a sample of the ongoing and the influential part of American English, the contribution of African American people, and that your purpose was to afford due recognition of language, our language, as a major force in shaping the American English language. So with regard to that, could you comment briefly on how you think our language has influenced American culture?
Sure. I think on this land we call America, which is not always called America, this is it's a geopolitical creation. You know, the United States of America is a political construct on the land of indigenous people who've been here for thousands of years. So the United States is an artificial creation. We want to make that clear. The Republic, what we call America, the American Republic. And so black people have been around since the very onset of what we call the United States of America since 1787. There were once one of every 5 Americans was black in the first census in 1790. So we're the, among the oldest people. We're not talking about the natives, we're just talking about the artificial construct of America, which was a European creation politically, and black people were engulfed into it, of course, eventually, first as indentured servants and then as slaves, where we spent most of our existence as a people, and our peoplehood was created here, and this language came out of a confluence of languages that I call American English. You know, the English brought a language here, the 17th century form of English language at that time, and then there were already languages here of the many, many indigenous people, and the Africans brought a huge complex of languages here. So when you speak English, American English, unlike English, you're using sometimes Native Americans and largely West African words. Like, for instance, when you go to caucuses, there's an Iroquois word. You say you go into the Democratic caucus.
Absolutely.
People in the 1920s used to drink hooch. That's liquor. And you wear moccasins, and you ride in canoes, and you go tobogganing, and on and on and on.
And we live in Seattle, and we are next door to Iowa, both of which are indigenous words. And
Minnesota.
Minnesota. I mean,
Wisconsin.
Minnesota. Caucus, given this the political tradition of Minnesota, tobacco, maize, so much of that. And when you talk about that confluence of culture, being that this was a geopolitical creation, and that it wasn't, and it was European model, and there were indigenous people here. One of the points you make in your book, you talk about indigenous people with regard to the Algonquin people, as well as African people, and you also mentioned Gullah people, and you talk about this confluence of culture, or this class of culture, in terms of language. So, with regard to language, you also say in that book, in your book, that language is life. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, that comes from a Navajo concept, that language is life. William James said it in the way that we can understand the Western mind. It says, the whole meaning of life comes back to a question of speech. Think about that. That's what...
Could you repeat that? I want our audience to really hear that.
Yeah. The whole meaning of life comes back to a question of speech. You know, that's what makes us human. You interpret the world out of these symbols we use called language. You feel, think, and so forth. That's what language does for us, and that's what makes us more distinct from other animals in the kingdom. I'm sorry if somebody takes offense to me using the word animal in relation to human beings, but we didn't create ourselves, so we're really a part of nature, like other animals. And language is a major thing that separates us. But let me add, in addition to that, I was talking about the confluence of languages and clash of cultures which helped create American culture, which is not generally recognized politically speaking. This is a white country. People call it white. They name it white. The people who govern the country up until very recently were white, and they think of it as white, but it's never been. One of my points, to matter of factly, without arguing politically, is how the country was created. And these were peoples, a collection of peoples, of Native American peoples, of which the Powhatan people in Virginia, where they first met, were representative of larger groups of people called Iroquois, and the Iroquois were in the northeastern part of the country all the way down to North Carolina, and you had the woodland Indians and the people who, clustered in, the Seminoles, Choctaw, Cherokee. You go out west, the Nas, and you see Comanches and so forth. Well, these were separate peoples at one time. They had separate languages, gods, and so forth. There's never been an Indian. That's a construct, political construct, imposed by Europeans. Just as there's never been a Negro, not really, language. But what there were Igbos and Hausas and Yorubas and Fulanis and Lukis and Balubas, people from West and Central Africa, who brought with them these words that we use every day, like banjo, okay, okra, gumbo, and so forth. You use jazz, you go on and on. These are African words.
And getting back to your point of this confluence of culture, that language is something that's living, it's alive, it's contributed by people in cultures and concepts, and so all that came together. And I get from your book, though, that with regard to African American people in particular, people who were enslaved people, because I think it's remarkable. I love your use of the word enslaved. It's a word that I feel particular. I like it. I like it because I never saw a country that was a country called slave. So you can't have people, from a country, unless they
were enslaved.
Yeah, exactly. So they were enslaved people.
Slaves,
So with regard to African American people, given their marginalization, from the institutional structure of this geopolitical construct, how do you, in this book, because you use words from different eras in terms of how black people utilize this confluence of culture from the indigenous people who were here and then people who were African and became this new people, African American, and the language. So can you talk about how black people their language became distinct in terms of expression from the other, from the culture?
You use the word marginalization. At one time, people were isolated, which is never literally, but I mean by law and by custom and so forth. And so you had a community of people who developed regular patterns of almost everything, not only speech, but food and gestures and the way they prayed, for instance, religion. The way black people practice religion is a complex of the legacy of Africa under largely Baptist and Methodist influence. I would argue that before the Civil War, what would be called black Christians was as much African as it was Christianity.
In
I think
what
the
sense?
well, it was communal. That shared, like in a value system that's shared, and it's carried on today. And the black churches are grounded in that tradition. That one of the major distinctions you make between white churches and black churches is that black churches are more democratic, more participatory in the ritual. It's not just the preacher who's got the stuff. Everybody has it.
In the ritual of worship, or in the ritual
call
of
and response,
service?
and God belongs to everybody, not just in white churches, if I may say so. People seem to go to worship the guy who's, the preacher's got it all. It's not, people don't call and response and answer back. People don't applaud after the choir get through singing in white churches. It's all sober and
and I think that it probably depends. I understand your point. I think it probably depends on the type of evangelical worship they're in, because there are churches. There are churches that where there's predominantly white people there, and evangelistic or Pentecostal, and so to that extent, there's adaptation. I think of the way that we have communal worship. I understand your point in terms of this marginalization and how people came together.
I'm generalizing, of course, and I hope it's an intelligent generalization, of course. That I would argue that the African content influenced the way particularly Southern people practice Christianity. It is more democratic among them. They're more participatory. I think that directly comes from an influence of African people. Just as you look at something that's conspicuous as music.
Absolutely. That's a good transition. That's a good transition. Because part of what you're saying, I think what I hear you saying, is that even the way that we worship, those people who were believers in Christianity, the way that they worship through their music, through their praise, through their worship, influence that, and that's derivative from African traditions and how they responded and related to the language.
Listen, let me cut to the quick. There's not nowhere in this country, if you live in America, the United States of America, there's no way for you not to be influenced by the presence of African people. I don't care whether you live in New York, California, Ogden, Utah, Texas, near the border of Canada. You're influenced by the presence of these people called African Americans, and that is largely, in a huge way, music. I mean, American music, to the extent that it's original, is African American music, to the extent that it's original. Now, everybody can see that but Americans, Europeans, Dvorak, Stravinsky, all of these great musicians who came here in the early part of the 20th century. But observe that. They're the ones who said that the only original art form created by America is Negro music. It comes from the Negro people. Now, the people around the world knows this, and I'm sure there are some whites, intellectually curious whites, would acknowledge that this is what American music is, whether you call it Negro spirituals or work songs or ragtime or jazz or swing or bebop or, or rock and roll or hip hop and so forth. It has one source. And what Americanized the music, we Africanized European music, which is based on resonance, kind of even keel. Ours is dissonance. It's with the rhythm dominates, and you can't hear music played on popular radio without hearing polyrhythms. That's not European. That's African.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Not only that, the falsetto voice and a lot of African devices of music is incorporated in what we call American music. The theater form that ended up being Broadway musical starts on the slave plantation. It's called the Blackface Minstrels, which there were a group of black people on plantation who did nothing but entertain the Jeffersons and Washingtons and so forth in skiffle band. Whites observed this, they imitated it, that's why you have the blackface. And it comes right down to vaudeville. In the book I mentioned that Sammy Davis wore blackface at 4 years old, even though he was black, because it had been standardized. Song, comedy, and dance as done by black people. And whites did it for years, right down to Al Jolson wore blackface in the first talking movie called A Jazz Singer.
And you know
yeah.
what's remarkable about that recitation, not to cut you off, is that
yeah.
even with slavery, the contribution of Black people, the uniqueness of language and expression was not even suppressed, even under the shackles of that lack of freedom.
Yeah.
We're going to come back to this.
Okay.
And we're going to take a short break.
Yeah.
I'm Pat Crumley, hosting today First World TV.
The moon and the sun once asked the earth, "Where are the women warriors?" The earth responded, "They have been scattered all over the world, but they can always be identified by the beauty in their eyes, which reflects the dignity and the greatness of the rainbow." We have to look for them. We have to bring them together, because it is only women warriors who know how to survive in the midst of so much suffering, struggling, struggling, struggling.